One of the things that struck me about the interviews I conducted was the lack of notice they get. They would often be told that they had to come in the next day. It really wrecked a lot of people's lives.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
We have Dev Wakely on the line from Alabama Arise. He is the worker policy advocate, and he recently authored a report on the state of Alabama's auto industry. Dev, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you back. So can you talk to us about the impetus for this report? What was it that made you want to survey, the state of Alabama's auto industry at this time?
Well, the industry has been really present in the state for around 30 years in some respect. The plants haven't been up and running quite that long, but the deals to ink the massive corporate subsidies to lure the industry here were put in place about 30 years ago. So we thought it'd be time to do a good sort of look back to see whether the promises of the industry really came to fruition or not. And particularly right now,
no,
sorry,
go
particularly ahead. Particularly right now, with auto manufacturing is a major part of industry in the state, and with the state of auto manufacturing nationally being in a real flux period where some real clawbacks and advantages can be gained for the workers, it makes perfect sense to be looking at it in the state right now.
I think so. I think that makes a lot of sense. Can you tell us, you mentioned that there's been a lot of subsidies. What is the scale of subsidies that's going to these companies from Alabama's public coffers?
I think the best way to describe it would be jaw-dropping. $1.6 billion in public funds have been used to lure these companies here. And one of the things that we found when researching this is that a lot of public dollars aren't really efficiently used. The better way to use public money to make industry want to be present in a state is to build out an economic infrastructure with a stable, high-wage, educated workforce base, not to just give them gobs of cash, which is what the state's decision has been largely.
And, so when a lot of times when people make purchases, there are strings attached. There are warranties. There are, if I give you, this money as an individual buying a product or service, and for some reason, by your own fault, the good or service does not meet the expectations that you set for me, then I have recourse to get my money back, right? So presumably, Alabama being so, controlled for, the last 100 years by quote unquote small government people, whether they were Democrats or Republicans, it's always been small government types, conservative types. Presumably Alabama was, we put in really good checks and balances when we gave this, hundreds of millions of dollars to these corporations, because this is the public's money and we've got to treat it with care. We've got to be very judicious with how we expend this money. So obviously Alabama has some strings attached to this money, right?
Oh, those strings are gossamer strands, man. The accountability mechanisms for those massive checks that the state basically wrote to these companies are practically non-existent. Very few companies deal with any sort of consequence for failing to meet, and the ones that do so via their own reporting. There's practically no monitoring. There are practically no meaningful wage standards. This is free money to the companies that don't really have to make good on any promises they make about wage quality, about job quality, about economic impact.
And so, that lack of strings, which again is just very strange, since, we're always told that the reason that we have to rein in public spending on services like Medicare and Social Security is because, we got to be responsible with our money. And so it's strange to me that these same people are just giving money for free without any strings attached to corporations. There might be something instructive there for the listener. So that lack of strings has really led to, you found, really led to a deterioration of this industry in certain very meaningful respects over the last 30 years. Can you explain that for us?
Sure. I'll lead with a big one. Alabama workers get much less pay for doing the exact same work as is done in other states. And that's because there's no wage standard that matches the national prevailing wage for auto manufacturing jobs in these incentive agreements. And that's huge. And we're talking about states that have similar costs of living to Alabama too. I mean, if you look at the Michigan standards, it costs almost the exact same to live in Michigan as it does in Alabama. Groceries are pretty much the same price, and they don't have a grocery tax. Gas prices are fairly similar. It costs ever so slightly less to buy a house in the Detroit MSA than it does in the Birmingham MSA. Wow. So it costs the exact same amount to live in most of Michigan as it does in Alabama. But Alabama auto workers get about $15,000 less a year to do the exact same work with the exact same codes. It's indefensible, and all it does is make Alabama workers less economically stable and less able to stand on their own feet. It's just further exploitation. That's the only way to describe it.
And, you know, that's always been the case. And in fact, that's been a part of the pitch. You know, there were a few different sides to this pitch that Alabama politicians and public leaders were making to these companies. And one was, we're going to give you all this free money, no strings attached at all. You can just have it if you come here. And then the second one was that the workers here are more docile, easily exploitable. You can pay them less. You can treat them worse. You know, that's always been the arrangement. Right. But your report actually stunningly laid out how Alabama workers today are worse off. Alabama auto workers today are worse off than Alabama auto workers 20 years ago. Can you talk to us about that progression or regression in this case?
Sure. One of the things that we saw that was really, really stark was a sort of regression to the mean. Now, these jobs were sold to the public as being higher quality manufacturing jobs, but that's becoming less and less true over time. So the real wages in the auto sector have been declining pretty precipitously over the last 20 years, to the point where we're seeing kind of a regression to the mean, to almost the overall manufacturing wage in the state. While the overall manufacturing wage has risen somewhat, the auto industry manufacturing wage has basically cratered, really.
So what was the, give us those numbers. What was the average manufacturing wage back in the early 2000s? And what was the average auto manufacturing wage in the early 2000s? And what was it for the latest data that you have in your report?
Oh, let's see here. Let me pull it up just to make sure I'm quoting correctly here. Well, first off, let me give you the differential wages across the state. The Michigan standard auto industry wage is the median is $80,500, and the Alabama in 2019 was $64,600. So 15 grand less for the exact same living. And let's see here.
And while you're looking that up, it's worth noting that $65,000 is the total average salary, not for a 40-hour work week, but for just how much, that's just how much they got hours of work irrespective, right? So, a lot of these people, $65,000, that sounds like a reasonable amount of money if all you're working is 40 hours a week. But by and large, that is not the case in Alabama's auto industry. And from talking to the people that I have in the auto industry, and this is reflected also in your report, that has become much the same with the wages. The wages have been falling since the early 2000s, while the hours worked have been increasing since the early 2000s. I spoke to some Mercedes workers last week, and they said that, when they started working there 20 years ago, a lot of these people who were at the center of the UAW campaign at Mercedes, They said that by and large it was like a normal work week. It was they worked 40 hours and they went home. Sometimes they worked a little more, but by and large it was 40 hours. And today the expectation, especially of new hires, is sometimes 6/12s, which is bonkers.
Jeez.
Right? And so then so that's who we're looking at, this population of people who are sometimes in many instances working 6/12s, making $65,000 a year. And that's a pittance when you're talking about 70 hours, 80 hours a week instead of 40.
Yeah, and you're spot on about the massive amounts of overtime. To 2019 specifically, too, was a period where just mandatory overtime was shot through the sector and the state. And one of the things that struck me about the interviews I conducted with folks working primarily at Mercedes at this point was the lack of notice they get. They would often be told that they had to come in the next day. It really wrecked a lot of people's outside of work lives, and it made it impossible to actually plan your own life around what you might be forced to do on very short notice.
Right.
That was a common refrain. The lack of scheduling notice and the lack of worker input into that was a major issue for pretty much everyone to talk to.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Right. One of the animating factors for one person, at least, that I talked to at Mercedes was that they've got this company handbook. This is the rules that the company has set for itself, and and so one of those rules is we're not going to make you work mandatory Saturday if we don't tell you before Thursday, right? So you can't be told on Friday as you're leaving, oh, by the way, you have to come in tomorrow, supposedly. And if you're kind of catching the tone of my voice, you will have guessed that they break that rule in their policy handbook. And so when that rule was broken one of these times, there was a group of workers that went to HR and said, they pointed to the book, said, look right here, you said you're not going to do this to me, and you're asking me to come in tomorrow, and I didn't have the notice that you said you were going to give me. And so then HR pointed to this other part of the book that says these rules are subject to change at any time for any reason by management. Right? So it's meaningless. It's totally meaningless, these handbooks. And like you said, it, without notice, without reason, without provocation, any of it can change for better or for worse. And in most cases, for worse.
Yeah, it is a lot of for worse. And that includes some disciplinary procedures, too. Recently, I was talking to the folks at Mercedes about the new hires and the way that, if you're conspiratorially minded, it looks like they see some significant work organizing coming down the pipeline and want the chance to remove any worker guardrails or safeguards for worker input into disciplinary procedures early on. So if they see somebody who's a pro-union, they can just get them out in a hurry.
Right.
And I think that's a pretty good way of looking at it. I think that eliminating disciplinary procedures for people that were long-standing too, for folks who were in their first 6 months of the hiring process and onboarding, looks just like a management power grab.
Right. And so those the numbers from 2002 to 2005, I can't remember them off the top of my head, the specific wages, but the delta was 11% in your report, right? Alabama auto workers in 2019 compared to Alabama auto workers in 2002 make 11% less.
Almost $8,000 lower in real wages. So 7,700 and some change less over the course of a year. It's brutal. That is a brutal figure. There's no other way to describe it. And it's not the way it's caused a long-term shift in the way that a lot of the workers in the sector view employment. So I was talking with some of the guys who've been at these plants for 20 years or so. And well, they're folks who were offered multiple buyout opportunities, because the companies decided that they wanted a newer, a younger workforce.
Right.
And the young folks come in and they don't view a job at Mercedes or a job at Hyundai or a job at Honda or Toyota as a career anymore.
Right.
It is a place for a couple of years to stop off because you can't build a life on it anymore. You could build economic stability at the wages that were offered in, say, 2002, 2005, and you flat out can't do it anymore. And it's a real, I mean, it's a rational decision on the part of the workforce. If you're not at a place where you're going to be able to buy a house or to raise a family or to even pay for your basic needs, why would you stay there?
And it's worth, explaining to people that when you say the average auto worker in 2019 makes $65,000, well, obviously that means 50% of auto workers are making less than that, but the numbers would be even more dire for new auto workers because since 2002 there have there's been a proliferation of multi-tier compensation packages. And so you've got at Mercedes, they actually just implemented 2-tier back in 2020. So your report wouldn't even capture kind of the damage that what Mercedes is doing. But so they have a second tier of permanent employment now that began in 2020 at Mercedes, and it's a full 20% lower. And the top out is 20% lower. And right, so for these second tier of employees, there is no hope of ever getting to the first tier. It's like if you came in after 2020, then the top out pay that you have is a full 20% less than people who were hired in 2019. And obviously that's going to cause some amount of consternation between the workforce. But then on top of that, you've got, in other places you have multiple tiers, of permanent employment. And then you have temporary employment, which your report points out can be as much as 50% as much as what permanent employees make, right? So if you're going into the auto industry today, right now, you're not making $65,000 a year. You're just not. That's not in the cards for you.
I live down in Baldwin County, and there are workers doing auto manufacturing in multiple sectors of employment in this state who are making less per hour than fast food restaurants pay here. It is brutal. It is not the way. There is no way you can build a life on that amount of money.
And your report doesn't touch on this, but it is worth mentioning that we talked about the lawsuit that former inmates and civil rights groups and labor unions are bringing against the Alabama Department of Corrections for basically a modern day convict leasing system. And auto industries were some of the alleged to be some of the top recipients of convicts by this leasing program, as well as we have seen multiple instances of child labor at these auto industries that, again, we are paying hundreds of millions of dollars to be here. The last thing that I'd like for you to expand on from your report is the safety issues. What can an auto worker expect by way of safety when they go work for one of these companies?
What you can expect is for that line to never stop. And that includes folks getting pinned to machines. It doesn't stop for that. It doesn't stop when somebody gets a hand stuck in a machine. And that happens. And it doesn't stop when people die on the line either. So if you look at how these companies really value the people who are doing the work, and people they say they value, you see how they treat folks, and you can understand that that's just simply not the case. Multiple people have died on the line at Hyundai, according to their workers, and the line never stopped. There was an attempt to, one of the interviews I had with a guy at Mercedes talked about a guy getting pinned to a machine, getting his hand crushed, and they wanted to pull him out before medical got there. They wanted to pull his hand out so that they could get production started again. Without any consideration of the medical reality, the fact that this guy might have a crushed artery or something that would cause him to bleed out on the line. The only concern was getting things running and getting that production quota, no matter what, and that includes the health and lives of the workers who are actually doing it in the no matter what.
Right. What is the?
I'll tell you.
Yeah. No. Go ahead.
Sure. I will tell you that the way to prevent that, the way to ensure that is to organize, and I think the workers see that now.
Right.
We hear a lot about what the state of about Alabama values and Alabama solutions. Well, unionization looks like to me an Alabama solution. It's always been an Alabama value. My great grandfather was a steel worker. My father was a carpenter. I'm CWA, and the reality is that if you're talking about actual Alabamians, people who do work instead of people who take in massive checks for doing nothing, then unionization is an Alabama value. Alabama has actually even now a higher private sector unionization rate than most of our southern neighbors. And to say that unionization is something that we should keep out is not in keeping with Alabama history. And it certainly doesn't value Alabama workers.
That's absolutely correct. What are some of the safety numbers in Alabama's auto manufacturing sector compared to the country at large, and then to some specific areas of the country like Michigan, where unions have an even stronger hold on the auto industry than in the nation as a whole?
I'm going to totally dodge that question. I'm going to point something else out to you.
All right. That
the workers themselves say they are disincentivized from reporting injuries. So when you see auto industry numbers in the state of Alabama that look only a little bit worse than they do in Michigan, that's not the full story, because workers are actively dissuaded from filing injuries or from filing their injury reports for a number of reasons. If you're talking about reassignment away from a more lucrative position to a worse role, that happens. If you're talking about folks who claim workman's comp, rightfully so, who are forced to come in there to the office during their recovery period while they're injured and just spend all day in a different like filing role, that happens too. The companies make every effort to avoid simply treating injuries for their workers and responding to the safety concerns, which is, again, as we pointed out, another impetus toward unionization, because unions provide better safety results, and the numbers are stark about that.
Right. And their ability to do that is a result of, the low unionization rate in the auto industry right now in Alabama. And it's also the result of a lack of safety enforcement in the state of Alabama. Alabama has no state safety law for the private or public sector. And so that leaves the only safety inspectors to be the ones from the federal government. And so that leads to, this ability to get away with the lack of reporting. Alabama has a lower than national average injury rate across sectors, right? Across not just the auto industry, but across sectors. Our reported injury rate is lower than the national average. And yet our reported death on the job rate is literally the fourth highest in the nation. Right. And so, unless you were literally born yesterday, you understand that what that means is that there's a lot of stuff that's being unreported, and your interviews with auto industry workers track with the data that we have, and the gaps in the data that we have for Alabama. And so I just wanted to point out some of these numbers for the in the comparisons to other states on the safety issues. You said in the report, by 2015, the chances of losing a finger or a limb in an Alabama parts factory was double the amputation risk nationally for the industry, 65% higher than in Michigan and 33% higher than in Ohio. So, this is just really, really, super unsafe. and the obvious response to that for the workers is to organize, because the government's not coming to save you. In fact, the government is attacking you. So Dev, is there anything else that you wanted to make sure that you point out in this report before we let you go?
In the report?
Yes, in the report, or just generally comments on the Alabama auto industry.
Absolutely, I definitely want to. I want to talk about some of the rallies that we've seen recently in the mood of the workers, and that is the reality on the ground is that workers know now, after a long period of egregious corporate abuses, that the way to proceed is to unionize if they want a better life. And that reality has kind of differed a little bit than what we saw even as recently as a few years ago. The UAW campaign success nationally has translated to the state in terms of organizing, and you see a state power structure that realizes that that's happening. And that's why you're seeing the response you're seeing at the state government level. They're scared of worker power building in ways that haven't been realized for the past 30, 40, 50 years.
Right.
And frankly, in the state of Alabama, ever. I feel comfortable saying that there is a broad cross-sector public understanding that the workers in the state have been getting a raw deal forever. And that's looking more and more like the power brokers and the corporate power structure of the state is going to have to make significant life-changing concessions on behalf of the workers.
Right. Dev Wakely, worker policy advocate with Alabama Arise. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Always glad to be here.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.